strategy. He's now saying he does, but if you look carefully at it, it doesn't yet go much beyond airstrikes. And the big question remains the political question. How do you get the other regional players involved? How on earth do you deal with the Sunni population in the Islamic State? And I don't think he's answered that quite yet. He
has got the regional powers involved, though, and it looks like he's got the UK too. You'd expect the UK to follow suit, presumably, and agree to strikes, would you?
I think that's likely, yes. If you're hearing both the statements from Ed Miliband and the fact that what the Prime Minister is asking for is quite limited, he's not asking for strikes in Syria, I would have thought the likelihood is Parliament will vote on Friday for strikes. But the question of the regional players is more complicated. Of course, you're absolutely right. These strikes have taken place, but the funding is very important. Countries like Turkey are very important. Turkey hasn't yet participated. That's the biggest player right there on the Syrian-Iraqi border, and we've got to watch that very carefully.
Mark Malloch-Brown, on a UN level now, what is the process? Does this go round in circles looking for a resolution like last time? Or
no, because actually a request by a country for support for its own security, that's it. You actually don't need a Security Council resolution. It's nice to have, but it's not necessary. And frankly, nor is it necessary for limited strikes on Syria if those strikes are aimed at those hostile elements that are trying to undo the Iraq government. I mean, that again falls under the rubric of responding to a request from the Iraqi government to defend its security.
Are we wrong to isolate the one from the other then?
I think we are. I mean, I think that the risk of striking into Syria is that we, again, like with Libya or like with Iraq in 2003, that a limited purpose gets dragged into a bigger regime change purpose, and that would be wrong. But in terms of doing the job now, the surgical strikes against ISIS in order to reduce and contain its military effectiveness, I think we're sort of unnecessarily tying our hand behind our back.
What about the whole question of the UN Security Council then? China and Russia traditionally opposing what the Western powers do. That's not going to happen here? It's not even going to go to Council? Or?
Well, as I say, I mean, I think like what will likely happen is it will come to the Council because the Iraqis, you know, in part address their plea to the Council. But my suspicion is that it won't come to a vote, because it'll be talked out and extensively talked out, which will allow the Russians and Chinese to say that it has been to the Council, they've not been bypassed, but where it will avoid a situation where the Russians feel obliged to veto. And as I say, it is completely different to Syria last year. That was attacks on a government which is still, however much you dislike it, the recognised government of the country. This is a response to a request by a government to help defend its territory.
And do you think the defeat of ISIS is possible?
I think it's going to be very, very difficult. If everybody says the two things you need are the regional players on side and the local population against them, there's not much sign of that yet moving. And remember, there are going to be players who are going to disrupt this. It's not clear really where, in the end, Iran, Russia, Bashar al-Assad are going to play out of that. They're going to be very worried by what they're seeing. They can see now Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, UAE striking into Syria. They're going to be wondering where they're going to turn next. And you can see Turkey stepping back too. So at the moment, I don't think anybody who pretends they can get rid of the Islamic State, as opposed to, as Mark said, contain them, degrade them, we can get rid of a lot of their equipment, but actually get rid of them entirely out of places like Mosul or Raqqa, much, much more difficult.
It's always tempting to look backwards and try and see the place where this could have been solved. But when you're looking at the political problems that Obama now faces, was he wrong to pull out of the surge when he came to power? Does that seem to you to be fundamental to the problem that's grown up now?
I think Obama made the right decision. It was a very difficult decision, but it was the right decision. In the end, what we've learnt about the surge is it was not sustainable. It was a military move. However much they talked about politics, it was military.
And yet it's a mess now.
And it was inevitably going to be a mess, because unless you could sort out the politics in Baghdad, it didn't matter that you had 130,000 troops on the ground, didn't matter you were spending $100 billion a year. It was only going to last 2 or 3 years, and that's what we found out.
The diplomacy element of this between the US and the UK, clearly America will be happy to have us on board as far as that goes tonight. But we're a minor player, aren't we? And we've already put caveats on. How useful are we?
well, there may be some intelligence assets, Cyprus bases, other things which are of a little bit more use and is immediately visible. But really, the utility of this is solidarity with the United States, solidarity with the international community, and in response to Iraq's request, the marginal military value is limited. And I think the risk is, even when the UK went in as a alleged equal partner in 2003 on Iraq, we actually quickly found that we were a junior partner. Yeah. The strategy was determined in Washington. More so this time. And the real core risk here is that we get dragged into a long conflict. The surge didn't end too soon, to pick up on what Rory was saying. What it demonstrated instead was there aren't military solutions in this region, and we shouldn't fall back into the trap of believing there are.
Thank you both very much indeed. Thank you. We've learnt tonight that amongst those killed in the strikes last night were British-born jihadis. Secunda Kamani has more, and he's here now. Tell us what you know, Sek.
Well, Emily, Ibrahim Kamara is a 19-year-old from Brighton who travelled out to Syria in February. And we believe he was killed in a US airstrike outside the city of Aleppo in Syria on Monday evening. We also believe that he was part of the al-Qaeda-affiliated group Jabhat al-Nusra. His mother spoke to the BBC earlier tonight, and she said she had no idea how he had become radicalised.
I'm just saying, whoever was responsible brainwashing my son to take this kind of measures, to go there, Allah will judge between me and them on the day of judgment.
Well, I have a source in Syria, and he's told me that Ibrahim Kamara was not the only British citizen to die in those airstrikes. He told me that 3 other men, all of Bengali heritage, all from the London area, were also killed alongside a number of Syrian and Dutch fighters. Now, America has said that it was targeting in these airstrikes a group that was plotting attacks on Western interests. But my source told me that these men had just travelled out to Syria to fight against the regime of Bashar al-Assad, which of course is accused of widespread atrocities against the Syrian population. And the group they were part of, Jabhat al-Nusra, it is part of al-Qaeda, it is a jihadist organisation, but it is also a lot less extreme, for example, than Islamic State, ISIS. And in some places in Syria, it's actually been fighting against ISIS. Now, today I spoke to a member of the moderate Syrian opposition outside Aleppo, a group that's pro-democracy, anti-Assad, but also anti-ISIS. And he told me that he fears that these US strikes against Jabhat al-Nusra will push Jabhat al-Nusra into a jihadist alliance with ISIS, and that would make the lives of him and others in the democratic opposition more difficult.
Few months ago, there was, let's say, troubles or problems between these two sections for Qaeda, al-Nusra and al-Dawla. But now, of course, they're gonna join each other to fight against, let's say, supportive people, allies.
Sek, a French hostage was killed by a group also linked to ISIL. What more do we know about that today?
Yes, that's right. A 55-year-old Frenchman was hiking in Algeria. He was kidnapped over the weekend by a jihadist group that declared its support for ISIS. They threatened to kill this man, Hervé Gourdel, if France continued its support for American and other Western airstrikes against ISIS in Syria. But today they released a video of his beheading. The French President François Hollande said it was a cruel and cowardly act, but vowed that France would not give in to blackmail like this.
Sek, thanks very much indeed. Let's take all the threads that we've heard this evening so far and cross to New York once more. We can speak to Mary Harf of the US State Department, who joins us from there. Mary Harf, thank you very much indeed for joining us. We appreciate your time. Your response to Britain's position tonight: can you fight ISIS in Iraq and not in Syria?
Well, a few points. We know that ISIL has grown very strong in Iraq. That's why you've seen the United States take direct military action against them there. So a key part of the strategy is pushing them back from the territory they've already taken in Iraq. We obviously know there's a key part of the strategy that involves Syria, which is why we've also now taken action in Syria. And look, each country will make their own decisions about how they can be a part of this coalition, and not all of that is military. In fact, a lot of it will be non-military things we need other people to do.
It seems extraordinary that in 2009, Obama came with this new chapter in US international relations, And the language tonight is pretty much a call of war. Is there acceptance now that the only way to fight terror is militarily?
Well, I think you've seen the president, President Obama, throughout his whole entire administration, take the fight very directly to terrorists when they threaten the United States. If you look at al-Qaeda in Pakistan and Afghanistan, if you look at al-Qaeda in Yemen, if you look at al-Shabaab in Somalia, he has never hesitated to take that action. This fight against ISIL is the next phase in that war against these jihadists who are trying to kill Americans and other people around the region.
And yet this was the man who defied words of John McCain when he was running for president, stopped the surge, pulled those soldiers out at a time when they could have stopped the mess that we're in now. Isn't that the legacy?
Not at all. Look, the war that we are going to be undertaking against ISIL looks nothing like the war that the previous administration went to in Iraq. These are wholly different military operations. What we are undertaking is targeted counterterrorism operations against a group. I would agree with your previous guest that nothing militarily we could have done would have prevented this rise of ISIL. There was a political vacuum in Iraq that led to sectarianism, that really led to the breakdown we saw in the Iraqi security forces. That's what we're trying to come back from right now, and that's what we're helping the Iraqis do.
Well, it's very interesting when you talk about targeted military operations. I don't know if you heard our correspondent just then who said, look, the US has targeted ISIS, but it's also targeted groups like Jabhat al-Nusra who were fighting ISIS. You have to decide if you're prepared to push two opposing groups closer together to create a greater ISIS force.
Well, I think that's a little bit simplistic reading of the situation. When we decide who to target in Iraq or in Syria, whether it's ISIS, whether it's Nusra, whether it's the Khorasan group, they have to present a threat to the United States or to our partners like Iraq. It has to meet that criteria. So we believe these all presented threats to us or to Iraq. That's why we took the action, and that's the standard we'll use going forward.
And realistically, and we know that President Obama has said this is just the beginning, this will amount to boots on the ground in some form, won't it?
Well, not American boots on the ground in combat roles. We've been very clear about that. The boots on the ground we need are the Iraqi security forces, the Kurdish forces, to get back on their feet. That's what we're helping them do. And also the Syrian opposition that we are supporting through a train and equip program to help a moderate opposition force grow there. But to be clear, there will not be American boots on the ground in a combat role. The president has been very clear about that.
Mary Harf, thank you very much. Well, the inquiry into the last Iraq war hasn't even finished. It was there, you might recall, that the then Attorney General Lord Goldsmith was accused by the Cabinet Secretary of changing his advice on the legality of military action just days before the invasion. So what would Dominic Grieve, former Conservative Attorney General, make of the same question this time round? He joins me now, and it's much more straightforward this time round. Would you agree?
Certainly straightforward insofar as the request by the Iraqi government for assistance is concerned. The Iraqi government is entitled to ask for assistance as a sovereign state. There's undoubtedly a state of internal armed conflict in parts of northern Iraq. And in addition to that, there seems to be clear evidence that some of the attacks are spilling over the border from Syria, and therefore they're entitled to invoke the right to self-defense. So as long as the Prime Minister considers that the United Kingdom can help in that, and that we can use reasonable, necessary and proportionate means to achieve a legitimate aim, which is to stop the unlawful activity taking place, and as long as he also pays close attention to ensuring that the law of war is properly observed, international humanitarian law, which can be a challenge when you're dealing with partners who don't always accept proper human rights standards, then the intervention by ourselves or indeed anybody else in support of the Iraqi government will undoubtedly be lawful.
But why then would he rule out Syria from what you've just said?
I think Syria is more complicated. There are grounds on which we could properly intervene in Syria. To begin with, there's no doubt that the Iraqi government, if they are being attacked from across the Syrian border by IS, are entitled to go across into Syria in order to stop those attacks.
I mean, just to make that clear, if we don't follow-up action in Syria, what we're essentially doing is an operation to get ISIS out of Iraq and nothing more, right?
Well, there's no doubt that getting ISIS out of Iraq is one legal framework. Intervening...
But militarily very ineffective.
Quite possibly. And the reality, of course, is that we know from what the United States has been doing that they're taking military action in Syria as well. But I think it's right that military action in Syria comes under a rather different legal framework. But that's not to say that it would be improper, but the Prime Minister would need to be satisfied that different criteria were met before doing it. And there is the problem about the Syrian government itself. The Prime Minister has made quite clear, I think for very good reasons, that he doesn't wish to engage with the Syrian government because its own reputation in terms of human rights violations is so appalling. But they are de facto the government of Syria, although their writ doesn't run in the areas where the military operations are likely to take place. But it does raise complications in terms of how one goes about intervening and what the consequences might be in creating a vacuum, and also at that stage whether it wouldn't be better to involve the United Nations and act under a UN resolution.
So when you talk about criteria, that's what you're saying. You're saying that you wouldn't do Syria without going through the whole chapter, literally, and verse, the resolution.
I'm not saying you have to have a UN resolution to go into... No, because undoubtedly, if you didn't consider that you could get a suitable UN resolution in Syria, you could take action under the doctrine of humanitarian necessity if it was preventing Kurdish villages being wiped out, or the Yazidis or other minorities being genocide being committed against them. And as I say, the Iraqi government is entitled to take military action across the border if the attacks are coming from across the border. I think there's no doubt that the Iraqis' allies can also act in concert with them for that purpose.
I mean, if America is already in Syria, what does that say about the legality? Are they doing something illegal that we're not following, or is it okay for them but not for us?
The United States, I think, has always approached these matters in a slightly different way from the way we do ourselves. Just listening to the lady from the State Department a moment ago, she made quite clear that under the doctrine that the United States has had ever since the 9/11, it will pursue Al-Qaeda and its affiliates anywhere in the world, including against if a government won't cooperate with them, it will do it whether that government wants it or not. So some of the interventions in Syria are almost certainly taking place under that heading. And others may be taking place under a different heading, but the United States has never clarified its view as to whether the doctrine of humanitarian necessity is one which it embraces. It undoubtedly does it in reality, but it has never actually explained it in legal terms.
Is your gut feeling, though, from a moral interventionist perspective, that David Cameron would want to go into Syria and that we probably will?
I don't think I can answer that. I mean, the Prime Minister clearly has a twofold problem, or not problem, issue tomorrow, on Friday. Firstly, he's got to persuade Parliament not so much about the morality. I think most parliamentarians looking at what's going on must conclude that it's difficult to think of anything much worse than IS. And that's the difference, isn't it, between this and last year, where there was an anxiety that destroying President Assad might deliver something worse.
All right, let's leave the morality aside. Do you think we could go into Syria?
I think that there's a proper basis for him to go into the United Kingdom to go into Syria. But I want to emphasise that that base has to be established. I don't have the intelligence. And so quite apart from anything else, it would be the law officers who'd have to consider that and give him advice. And I wouldn't wish in any way to prejudge that issue. But there are circumstances in which it would, in my view, be proper to intervene in Syria.
Dominic Grieve, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Now, much has been made